Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Hao Huang, Associate Professor of Social Sciences, and welcome to the Illinois Tech Social Sciences Great Problems, Great Minds seminar series. For today's speaker, Dr. Thomas Walstrum. We will open the floor to the question at the end after the talk lecture. So today's speaker, Dr. Thomas Walstrum, a senior business economist in the economic research department at the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. His responsibilities include the seventh district of district's contribution to the benchmark, the Chicago Federal Reserve of Economic Conditions, and the briefs for the Chicago Federal President on 7th District economic conditions. He also is contributing author to the bank's Midwestern economy blog. His research concentrates on labor economics and urban and regional economics. Dr. Walstrum holds a bachelor degree in economics from Wheaton College, Illinois, and a PhD in economics from the University of Illinois at Chicago. It's great to have Dr. Tom Walstrum.
So I guess I need to speak into the microphone, right? Okay. All right. Oh, that's yours. That's yours. Sorry. Okay. So it's actually the case that you can interrupt me with questions. We were just talking about the culture of economic seminars, and it's definitely the case that we're used to being interrupted, and I'm totally fine with that. And I don't know, can I take questions? I guess I can take questions from the chat on the...
Yeah, as well. Yes.
Okay, so yeah, so if you're online, you want to interrupt me with chat question. Oh, I don't want to do that because you're going to see that. Yeah, let me minimize this. Okay. Yeah, so what I'm gonna let me give you just a brief overview of what I do at the Fed. Is everyone here familiar with the Federal Reserve? See, is that a yes in the back? Yeah. Okay, so so let me just ask too, like how many of y'all have taken a Economics 101 class? We got about, all right, everyone has. Okay, so I'm going to kind of do an Economics 101 talk. We're going to cover a whole bunch of Economics 101 concepts, and then talk about how the Fed fits into that a little bit. And it's going to be in the context of kind of the current state of the economy and the forecast for the economy as well. And then I'm also going to talk about the region. So my focus within in my work within the Fed is on the Midwest economy. So I'm going to talk about that and kind of what's the outlook for the Midwest economy, and I'm going to talk a little bit about Illinois too, and then talk about try to get into why I think things are the way they are. So yeah, let me just tell you a little bit more about how I fit into the Fed. I was telling some folks just a second ago. So I'm in the research department, and the research department is kind of like an economics department within the Federal Reserve. So it's like a little piece of academia attached onto a government organization. And so what we do is there's all kinds of research that goes on across all the different kind of subdisciplines in economics, including macroeconomics, of course, but also micro and labor. That we have a health economist, we have people who specialize in finance, all with kind of the goal of understanding the economy so that we can make good decisions for our one kind of policy lever, which is the short-term interest rate. So my job is actually to talk to people. I do some academic research and publish in journals, but and I also write kind of shorter blog posts, or I guess they've stopped calling them blog posts. They're now just articles. But I write those, but then also do a fair amount of just talking to people, because one of the things that we need to that we do to understand the economy is just talk to business leaders who are active in the economy. So I survey business leaders. We bring them into the bank and feed them lunch and ask them how things are going. And we gather this qualitative information and put it in a report. There's a public report that comes out called the Beige Book that comes out 8 times a year. And then there's also internal reports that we put together for the president for helping him make a decision about what the interest rate should be. Okay, so that's what I do. And one of the things I do too is I go out in the public and give talks. I sometimes it's to groups like this, sometimes it's like to the Chamber of Commerce in Dubuque, Iowa. And they want to have someone come and give an update to the business leaders in Dubuque, Iowa. So I'll go, I drove to Dubuque and gave them a talk similar to this. All right. So let's get started. And so I guess this is kind of an academic setting. So I'm actually, usually I just tell people what or a classroom setting. Usually I just tell people what everything is here, but I'm going to actually ask you if what this all means for a second here, if you don't mind being quizzed. Okay, so this is a forecast for real GDP growth. Can anyone tell me what GDP is? Anyone want to take it? All right, there's gross domestic product. Okay, and you want to hazard a guess at what that means, or tell me a definition of gross domestic product?
Know it, but it's hard to explain it.
Okay, anyone else want to make a guess? Go ahead.
All of like the goods that I guess are created like in a certain amount of time.
Yes, that's exactly right. And by goods, goods and services, but that's exactly right. So it's the Bureau of Economic Analysis going and trying to add up everything that's been produced in the economy. They release a quarterly number. So it's every quarter they go and try to take the total dollar value of everything that's produced in the economy within a quarter. And that's what GDP is. Now, does anyone know what the real part in front of GDP means? It's okay to answer more than once. Go ahead.
I know the purchasing power parity is like with relation to like the different exchange rates, and then the real is like not taking that into account.
That's close. I think you switched it actually. So real means that we're adjusting for inflation. So either it's nominal as in current dollars, real is they try to take out inflation. So we're interested in real GDP growth. Oh, wait, we're interested in growth. I'm just going to tell you why we're interested in growth. We expect GDP to grow over time. Every quarter on average, it's going to grow. The reason is 2 reasons. One is population growth. So if you have more people in an economy, you're going to have more people, assuming that they're working age, you're going to have more people working and producing stuff and more people consuming stuff. So that makes the economy grow just simply by having more people. You add people, they're both suppliers of stuff and demanders of stuff, and you're going to get growth. The other reason is technological progress. All right, so we over time we get more and more we get more and better technology that allows us to be more productive and do more in the same number of hours of work per day. So, or more per hour in work. So that's another reason. Whereas even if you had constant population, you could still get GDP growth because of productivity improvements. All right, so we expect GDP to grow over time. And if it's not growing, that's a recession, and that's not good. That usually means people are out of work. If it is growing, that's normal. Fast growth, typically we think of that as better than slow growth. All right, so the other thing, so I think that's everything. So let me we'll keep looking at this chart. The solid blue part of the chart is what's happened. That's actual data. The dashed part is what's forecasted by a company called S&P Global. Now the Fed, again, our job is to try to, actually I haven't told you what our job is. Our job is to try to have stable prices and maximum employment. By stable prices, we mean inflation. We actually have defined our goal for inflation to be 2% per year. And actually, let me just define inflation. I'm not going to quiz you on this one. Mm-hmm. Inflation is just the price of everything going up over time, where it's not that you're getting more. It's just that, your earnings are more, price of everything is more, and this goes up over time, and the Fed's target is 2%. That's what we've said it publicly. We're going to shoot for 2% inflation, and then given 2% inflation, we want to have as many people in the working as possible. Okay, so got lost here. I forget what my thought was. Oh yeah, so we at the Fed produce our own forecasts to help us try to understand where the economy is going, to help us decide what the policy should be, what the interest rate should be. But I'm not going to put those. I'm not going to put that up. It's a little more limited in what's public than this S&P Global forecast. But they're going to be what I'm going to show you is pretty similar to what the Fed forecast is. Okay, so what is the forecast? The forecast is slow growth. All right, so what does slow growth mean? It means below trend. So I just said we expect GDP to go up over time. There's an estimate of trend growth that's about 1.8%, and that's what I've called longer run here. So the forecast is for growth to be a little bit below trend, 1.5% for over the next year. All right, and that's a little bit below trend. It's not much, and that comes after 2023 was actually a really above trend strong year, and unexpectedly strong. If we looked at this chart a year ago, there were a lot of people who were thinking a year ago that we were going to be in recession. Do you all remember that discussion? Okay, so there was an expectation we were going to be in recession. That didn't happen. We actually had growth be faster than expected and above trend. So we'll talk about that a little later. But yeah, so the forecast for this year, though, is below trend, slightly below trend. And this is in line with inflation slowing and kind of typically when you have below trend growth, you should see inflation slow some. So that's going to be part of the reason that we expect slow growth is that inflation has to slow. And a big part of that is because the Fed still has its foot on the brakes right now. And I'm going to show you the interest rates in a second. Okay, so what could get in the way of this forecast coming true? Forecasts never come true perfectly, or it's rare, or it's just lucky if they do. And last year everyone thought it was going to be slow growth in 2023. It wasn't. So what could make this forecast not come true? I'm going to talk about reasons things could be worse than expected. First is that inflation doesn't keep slowing. So inflation has come down a fair amount, but we're not yet to the Fed's target. So if inflation didn't come down more the way that we're hoping it will, the Fed might have to raise rates or keep rates higher for longer, and that could slow the economy. The other thing that could happen is that, and I should say too, just to make sure we're all on the same page, higher rates means that it gets more expensive to borrow and invest, and that slows down demand in the economy and should slow GDP. So the other thing is that rates are really high right now, but so the second point here, unknown lagged effects of interest rate increases. Rates are really high right now, and it takes time for rates to affect the economy. So high rates take, I have a mortgage, and it's actually my mortgage rate is quite low right now. Now, if I went out to buy a house, I'd have to pay a really high mortgage rate. But I'm not paying that right now. The high interest rates haven't affected, at least for the cost of owning a home, haven't actually affected me yet. All right, so it takes time for when rates go up for it to affect the economy. And it's possible that the high rates that are out there, as they continue to affect people and households and businesses more and more as time progresses, it could be that those effects are stronger than expected, and that could be another reason that the economy slows down more than expected. Third reason is geopolitical upheaval. So that's been going on. That's something that's always going on. It's something that we're thinking about maybe a little bit more because of the Ukraine invasion and the Israel-Palestine situation, where there's some disruption to shipping in the Red Sea. And if things escalated further, you could see further problems with shipping or other parts of the economy that could potentially slow the global economy and then the U.S. economy. So far, that hasn't been a huge effect, but it's something that people are talking about. All right, so that's the overall outlook. Are there any questions yet here? Or are we all good? Okay, I'm going to speed up then for slides. I'm not going to take as long as I did for this one slide. So let's look at unemployment. So I said already that the Fed's goal is maximum employment. What does maximum employment mean in terms of the unemployment rate? That's right around 4%. That's an estimate. No one knows exactly what kind of the rate of full employment is, but 4% is right about what people think it is right now. And we're actually below 4% right now. So the unemployment rate's about, I think it's 3.8 or 3.9. And with this slow growth in the coming year, there's the expectation that the unemployment rate should rise some. However, there's not this expectation that we're going to get to anywhere near a recessionary level. So a recessionary level would maybe be somewhere between at least 5 and 6% unemployment. This is a forecast for what's called what people are referring to as the soft landing. Has anyone heard the soft landing term? Okay, all right. So this is a soft landing where we have inflation coming down and growth being slow, but not too slow, and unemployment doesn't really go up hardly at all. So that's what we're looking at actually, is kind of the ideal scenario, kind of the dream that the Fed has whenever things are not whenever either inflation's too high or unemployment's too high. The goal is to get somewhere back to somewhere close to where we are right now and where the expectation is that we'll be for the coming year. So let's hope this comes true.
Actually has a question.
Sure.
From the class. It asks about the needs unemployment. Is
Yeah.
Considered undocumented.
Oh, does unemployment consider undocumented? That's a good question. So let me tell you how the unemployment rate is calculated as best as I know. So they have a survey. They go out and find households. I actually participated in the survey for one year. And so it is a household survey. So they just go, they have a record of every address in the entire country. They go and do a random sample of every address, and it's about 60,000 households that they survey, or I think it's 60,000 people. So it's probably more like 30,000 households. And my understanding would be that they don't ask about citizenship. They're just they just go to addresses. They don't care like which address. They don't check anything. It's just actually someone showed up to my door and took in my information on a computer. No questions about immigration status at all. So it would have been, if you're here and it's just a question of, are you working? Are you looking for work? Are you not working? So my guess is that it would include undocumented workers, or undocumented households, although my guess also is that undocumented households might ignore the person knocking on your door to maybe more likely to ignore that person. So it's definitely would be a measurement problem, but I don't think they're by design excluded from the survey. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay. Yeah.
So on the previous slide, to what do you attribute the higher than expected growth rate in 2023?
Yes, I'm going to get to that. So I have a whole section on that. So we'll get there. I'm glad you asked, because that means I put together a good presentation.
You mentioned that you were going to get there too. So
okay. All right, so let's look at inflation. So there are many different ways to calculate inflation. The one that's most commonly reported on in the news is the Consumer Price Index. This is not the Consumer Price Index. This is an alternative one called the Personal Consumption Expenditures Price Index. This is what the Fed actually pays more attention to. There are some technical reasons with how they're calculated, these different indexes, that the Fed thinks this is kind of the better one. It has to do with allowing people to, the CPI has a fixed basket of goods. So if prices change, you might actually switch from, like if the price of peanut butter goes up, you might switch to tuna fish or something. So the CPI doesn't allow you to switch. They have a fixed basket of goods. The PCE takes into account that you might substitute away from peanut butter to tuna fish. And so it tends to be lower. But that's not why the Fed picked it. They just think it's a better overall way of thinking about how inflation affects the economy. So the other thing though is that this is the core PCE. And what that means is it's taking out volatile food and energy prices. So it's a smoother line, and that gives you kind of a better idea of what's kind of underlying longer run inflation is. And then this is a 12-month percent change. So this is just telling you over time how the rate of the 12-month rate of inflation has changed. So you can see that, at the end of 2023, we were at about 3% inflation by this measure over the previous year. The forecast for the coming year is that really we're going to get to the Fed's target. So their S&P is forecasting a 2.1% inflation rate, which is basically the Fed's target. And it's actually, if you looked at the last 6 months or so, we already are, if you just took the inflation rate over the last 6 months and assumed that would keep going for the coming 6 months, we're already, that's close to 2%. So we're in many ways, if what's going on right now continues for another 6 months, we're going to get there. And that's why you can see this kind of, weird thing where there's this really big kink in the line where it doesn't, usually you want the things to be smooth, but like just the way that this is a 12-month percent change, and it's a month. That's the interest rate or the inflation rate's calculated every month. So you can, if we get to the point where we have 6 or 12 straight months of 2% inflation roughly, then I guess you can get a kink like this. So anyway, this is the other thing that is definitely what would allow for the soft landing, is that inflation's got to get down to 2%. All right, let's keep going. Okay, so this is the forecast. This is the Fed's policy rate. So there are many, many interest rates out there in the economy. There's mortgage rates, there are rates on credit cards, there are rates on auto loans, there are rates that businesses have to pay banks to get loans to buy equipment. And there's also this interest rate that the Fed sets, which is the kind of the shortest run rate you can possibly have, which is it's a rate for overnight loans. So banks, to make sure that they have all their funding in line every night to settle they have to settle their books, and they need to have a cash on hand. And if they don't have as much cash as they need for whatever reason, they actually go and borrow from other banks to have the cash they need. And they have to pay some interest rate on that, and it's a rate for just one night. Okay, so that's the rate that the Fed sets. That's this rate. And this is, of course, annualized. Or it's not annualized, yeah, go ahead.
How is like the Fed able to, I guess, set that? Is that just
Yeah.
through, like, I guess, like through supply and demand, or?
Yeah, so this has actually changed since in the last, I guess, since the financial crisis, since 2008. The main way that we do it is the Fed is a bank for banks. So every bank has to have put, like we put deposits in banks of our savings, if you're lucky enough to have savings. And then the banks have to have cash on hand as well. The banks go and deposit that at the Federal Reserve. So we're the bank for banks. And we give banks an interest rate on those deposits. So we pay banks when they put money in their account at the Fed, we give them an interest rate on those loans, or on those deposits. And basically, if we're giving a higher rate, if you can get as high of rate, if you can get a rate at the Fed that's a certain rate, say, I guess 5.375, you're not going to be, you're not going to want to have that money. The only way that you're going to not keep your money just parked at the Fed is if you can get a higher rate somewhere else. Okay, so when we raise the rate that you can get for just parking your money at the Fed, that's going to raise the rate that banks make loans to each other or to other parts of the economy. So the idea is that we can kind of put a floor on the interest rate by raising the rate that we pay banks when they deposit with us. And then if we lower that rate, that's going to give more incentive for banks to take the money out of reserve deposits at the Fed and go use it making loans to businesses or each other. Does that make sense to everyone? I'm not sure I did that perfectly, but that's basically how it works. Okay, so there's this overnight rate, and overnight rates add up to longer term rates over time. Okay, so what's expected to happen here? So the S&P says that they think that rates are going to start coming down sometime this year. And that's again because that assumes that the inflation keeps coming down. If it does, then the Fed's going to feel comfortable lowering rates. And the Fed itself, they put out quarterly, I hinted at this, they put out quarterly a summary of economic projections. It's called the SEP. And the people on the committee who decide what the interest rate should be, have in their own forecast said that they think that they're going to be able to start lowering rates this year. But that doesn't mean that rates are going to be low, right? So what you can see at the end of this chart is a dashed line, and that's kind of the terminal rate where we're going to get if everything just kind of gets to the ideal situation where growth is at trend, unemployment's at 4%, inflation's at 2%. Then the Fed would lower its rate to this neutral rate there that we call it. And no one knows exactly what that rate is, but guesses are that it's somewhere around 2.625%, and that's what S&P is guessing here. And so what this means is that the Fed's going to be putting the brakes on the economy for likely until sometime in 2026. So it's still going to be putting pressure to slow the economy some, even though rates are expected to start falling. Okay, so I just said there are a bunch of different interest rates. Here are a couple indicators, one produced by us at the Chicago Fed, one produced by the Board of Governors, that try to summarize all the different interest rates in the economy. So these are called financial conditions. One's called the Financial Conditions Index, and another is the Senior Loan Officer Opinion Survey. Don't worry about trying to interpret what the numbers mean. Just know that positive means that these indicators suggest that there's tightening in the financial market, and then negative means that there's loosening in the financial markets. So when the Fed starts lowering rates, that would start counting as loosening, at least in the overnight loan market. All right. Now, these indicators are saying that there's already some evidence that there's loosening happening in the financial system as a whole. Loosening meaning that it's getting easier to take out loans and get credit. At least the blue indicator is now in negative territory, so it's saying that there's already this out there, at least for some borrowers, it's getting easier to take out a loan. The red line says that it's not that it's getting easier, but it's getting, the pace of tightening is slowing. All right. So we're already starting to see a little bit of action in the financial markets of the expectation that the Fed is going to start lowering rates. Okay, so now we're going to get to your question, which is, we had this strange year in 2023 where we actually had above trend growth. So we had strong growth and we had falling inflation. So how could that be? Normally, strong growth and strong inflation and high inflation come together. When there's a recession, you have slow growth and you have slowing inflation. But last year, we actually had faster growth, strong growth, and slowing inflation. And so how could this be? Well, the macro 101 answer, which is what I'm going to give, is that we actually had improvements on the supply side. So when the Fed's putting the brakes on the economy, it's affecting the demand side. But in this case, we actually had a situation where we had improvements on the supply side where you could get stronger growth and not have price pressures pushing up inflation. So there are three reasons I'm going to give you that I think help explain this phenomenon in 2023. All right, so number one is that we actually had an improvement in the labor force participation rate. So this is one of the things that goes into calculating the unemployment rate. You have to be in the labor force to be unemployed. Being in the labor force means you're either working or you're looking for work. If you're not looking for work or working, you're out of the labor force. And the question the labor force participation rate calculation asks is, what percent of the population 16 and over is either working or looking for work? And so that's what this number is. You can see it has a downward trend. And this is the result of an aging population. We have a generation of baby boomers that's retiring, and they're expected to keep retiring. That's why the S&P's forecast is for this to keep going down. And so that's why it's going down. But I want to highlight, if you look at the red line here, you can see that's what happened in 2023. If I'd put up this chart in 2022, you would have seen the same forecast from S&P, just starting at where we were in 2022. So S&P thought that at the end of last year that we had reached as high of labor force participation as we were going to get before just kind of going back to the trend, the downward trend. It turns out that the labor force grew in a way, or it grew actually a fair amount. And this is one way that you can have faster GDP growth without having pricing pressures. So you get more workers in the labor market, more stuff's getting produced, but there's less wage pressure. So there's businesses are having an easier time finding workers. They don't have to raise wages as much to find workers, and so then they don't have to raise prices as much. So this is one way that you can have growth without having price pressures, is a higher labor force participation rate. And that was an unexpected thing. Now, I think this is a one-off thing. I think S&P is probably right. We can't expect another further expansion of the labor force participation rate, but this was a nice thing for 2023. All right, next thing is supply chain problems. So I'm guessing many of you heard about the supply chain issues of 21 and 22. So this is and 2020. So this is an index of supply chain pressures where, again, a positive number means supply chain pressures are worse than average, and negative means supply chain pressures are better than average. So if you don't have supply chain pressure, when you have supply chain pressures, this is something where it gets harder to find inputs or the stuff you want. People start bidding up prices. When you don't have supply chain pressures, it's cheaper for businesses to produce stuff. There aren't pricing pressures. And in fact, in 2023, we saw shipping prices really fall. And so this is one way that you could, again, have more stuff being produced without having to raise prices. Right now, this index got back to 0, which is kind of average at the end of the year. You might have, before these last few ticks, you might have been worried that it was kind of going back up into positive territory, which would be bad. But it looks like it's kind of settled down to normal. This is another one-off thing where we can't really expect to see this improve further, I don't think, which is, it's hard to think that we're going to have another supply side shock or surprise, at least from this channel, again in 2024. Okay, the other thing is that productivity picked up. So this is just, I mentioned productivity earlier. This is a measure of output per hour worked. So you just think about how, the way to think about it that's kind of easy to think about is think about making a car assembly factory. You're putting together a car. The question is, how many worker hours do you need to assemble a car? And if the number of worker hours needed to assemble a car goes down, you get an increase in productivity. And as I mentioned, productivity tends to go up over time because of technological progress. And we saw big improvements in productivity in 2023. A couple other things that are interesting about this chart. One is that you can see productivity goes up a lot during recessions. And this is because typically when when recessions happen, we see the unemployment rate go up. And typically the people who get laid off during recessions are below average productivity workers. So you have a smaller number of people working. They tend to be the ones who are left when there's a big high unemployment rate. They're the ones who tend to be more productive. So you end up getting a increase in the productivity measure.
An alternative explanation is that those people that are still working are willing to work longer hours for the sake of not losing their job.
Yeah, well, it wouldn't be longer hours, but because this is adjusting for that, but it would be perhaps that and I think I think we definitely heard stories of this during the pandemic where people were, working like crazy And maybe the higher pressure to get more stuff done because there was less, because there were fewer people around meant that there was less time spent, on Facebook or whatever, right? Or TikTok. Sorry, Facebook's not cool anymore. But I think the that's probably true, but I think the more straightforward explanation is change in the average productivity of, or the average productivity of the people who are actually still working. But then, as the unemployment rate comes down, just like you see here, we saw this both after the Great Recession and the pandemic recession, productivity flattens out as people re-enter the less productive people re-enter the labor force. And in the case of the pandemic, we actually saw productivity go down. Now, S&P thought at the beginning of last year, people thought that we'd kind of gotten back to trend and that we were just going to keep growing at trend. But in 2023, we actually had faster than trend productivity growth. And the weird thing about that is that you would expect that, the people who are rejoining the labor force would not be the most productive people. So the story I just gave about labor force competition or composition kind of goes against that for 2023. So it's not really clear what's going on here. And I've looked around and I haven't really seen any great explanations for why we had an increase in productivity in 2023. People are just mostly speculating. One is actually, it's possible that there's measurement problem. It's really hard to measure. It's easy to measure productivity at a car factory. It's a lot harder to measure productivity, say, at a university, right? I mean, there's maybe, you all have some measures of productivity, but overall, like, your ability to get knowledge into students' heads, like it's kind of hard to measure how successful you were at that, right? So, I mean, you have your ways, but I don't think this was measurement error because it's showing up in the other data. We got good growth without inflation, so this is at least probably part of the story, and then it's just up to time to try to figure out. Maybe we'll get it. Maybe this will get revised away, but at the moment we really don't know. Go ahead.
Gonna have a kind of silly explanation, maybe
Sure.
Chat GPT.
Yeah. That's what people want to throw out there. That's definitely, I mean, so there was a New York Times article about this recently. That was one of the ideas that they were throwing out there for sure is the rise of AI. I think it's a little, I mean, what they said in that article, they talked to a more, a more reputable economist than myself for the article. And I think I agreed with the person's take, though, which was that I think it's a little bit too soon for the AI stuff to really be affecting productivity growth.
Well, I would think that at least like helping learn, like, and I can only talk to my experience.
Yeah.
It helped me learn way faster. So
Yeah.
I think maybe something like people having more time to work and not spending so much time studying that could.
Yeah. No, I mean, I think I would agree that I can see. I know that there are applications where it really does improve productivity, and my expectation is that it will end up raising people's productivity. I'm just not sure that it's gotten there yet. Okay, we got another idea in the back.
What about the overall automation in the country? Does that affect the productivity of community?
Yeah.
Because automation is always being automation innovation is always being implemented within in the society.
Yeah.
So just in general, rather than the area, because AI is basically an embryonic form of technology. But the other stuff, the things that are going on in terms of automation, that has an overall effect on the productivity of the need for humans.
Yeah. No. So I think AI is a great example of how we're going to automate a new way that we can automate things, right? So there's automation of, again, like making a car with robots. There's all this kind of new robot technology that's coming out. And then I think AI is another way that, at least for me in my work, it's going to help me code a little bit faster, right? So yeah, I think it's just another technology that's come along that's going to that is going to keep driving this line up, right? I mean, you can throw out maybe some work from home stuff. I mean, my best theory is that 2023 was a year that we kind of figured out how to actually do work from home and hybrid work effectively. I don't know if that's, I don't have any evidence for it, but that's my thought. Okay, so I think, all right, yeah, okay, so that's all I've got on the US, the macro economy. Now I'm going to turn to the regional economy, and I think I guess I only got half an hour, right?
I just wanted to ask.
Yeah, sure.
one quick question. You're gonna dip out in a second anyway. What about stimulus? I mean, is that you're not mentioning anything about government, the Inflation Reduction Act or any of those efforts? Does that trickle into any of these explanations?
So I think the stimulus was playing a huge role in the, so stimulus was playing a huge role a few years ago. Let me go back to GDP. I think that the stimulus was a demand side intervention along with the Fed lowering rates to really make demand be strong. And I think it definitely had an effect on the demand side and drove inflation along with supply side challenges. So we had both a supply side cut, on the labor force and on the goods side that pushed prices up. And then we had strong stimulus that also pushed demand up. And so that's why, I think the demand side is certainly a big part of why we had just a really rapid recovery from the pandemic. I mean, the turner, we were already back to GDP. GDP was already back to where it was before the pandemic. If you compare where we were with the Great Recession, GDP was still in terms of timing, GDP was still going down in the number of months after the Great Recession started when we'd already fully recovered from the pandemic. So the stimulus definitely affected inflation and growth coming out of the pandemic. Does that answer the question? Okay, but I think the stimulus, it had a longer effect than we thought because a bunch of it went into savings, and there's still been a play out of people's spending down savings. But I think we're pretty much back to that. The savings have been pretty much spent at this point. We're kind of back to pre-pandemic savings levels. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the regional economy because that's my focus. So my job is the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago has a district. There are 12 reserve banks. One is the Chicago Fed. There's a Cleveland Fed. There's a St. Louis Fed. There's a Philadelphia Fed. They split up the country into 12 regions. And part of this was like 100 years ago. And the reason they did that was to make it easier to manage the bank support services that we provide when transportation was a lot more expensive. But we still kind of every regional bank still has to kind of keep track of, is told to keep track of its region. So the Chicago Fed's region is Illinois, Indiana, Iowa, Michigan, and Wisconsin. So we're like right in the middle of the Midwest. And so I spend a fair amount of time thinking about the Midwest economy and thinking about how the Midwest economy works relative to the US economy. So I'm going to be talking through that. And let's start with kind of the near term. So when you start looking at regional data, you can't use GDP anymore. They actually produce regional GDP numbers, but they're not really that useful. They make a whole bunch of assumptions that it's not clear that they should be making. So what I usually look at are the jobs numbers, and this is just kind of going in. Actually, they go and look at the total number of people working that are getting a paycheck every month. And they just count it up. So it's kind of it's a raw piece of data that there's no modeling that goes on. It's just a number. And it tends to track the economy, the state and local economies pretty well. And so that's why I like to use it when I start looking below the US economy. And so let's not worry about exactly how this is calculated, or actually I'll describe it for a second. So this is a 3-month % change in a 3-month moving average. And so what that means is I'm taking the 3 most recent months, taking an average, and then taking months 4 through 6, taking another average, and then doing the percent difference between those two. And so it's kind of a smoothing. We're kind of looking at how much employment has changed over the last, it's a quarterly change in employment, but smoothed across 6 months. Or it's calculated every month. And all this is trying to do is just give you kind of a shorter run take on what's happening with the economy at these different levels. So let's not worry about it exactly what the numbers mean, but let's look at how the shape of these lines. So you can see that there was really strong growth in employment in 21 and 22. 2023, you saw employment growth slow, but not go negative. And then I've also got up here the averages. And at least for the Midwest in the US, we're pretty much back to average employment growth. So just another sign that we're kind of, the economy's really gotten back to its kind of long run normal level of operation. Now, Illinois here is really low. It's actually showing that the quarterly growth rate was negative for Illinois' employment over the last, if you compare the current 3 months to the last 3 months to the 4 through 6 months. I'm not too worried about this. I think this is a measurement issue. This is also a survey. They update the data every year, and they benchmark them. And if you look at kind of the levels, you're going to see there's a blip. So I actually think Illinois' blue line should probably be a little bit closer to its long run average. But the other thing I want you, the actual thing that I want to care about beyond saying that we're kind of back to normal is that there's a clear difference between the U.S. number and the Midwest and Illinois numbers, where the U.S. and Illinois, or the Midwest and Illinois numbers are consistently slower than the U.S. So that's what I'm really interested in, is that there's this long run development where the Midwest, including Illinois, grows more slowly than the U.S. as a whole. And so a question I think a lot about is why. Okay. Why? You want to know why? Okay, that's what I'm going to try to tell you next. But I want to show you a few more data points. So this is something that's been happening for decades. So this is employment growth by these regions across multiple decades. So since the 1970s. All right. So this is just the average employment growth rate by decade for each of these regions. And you can see that with the exception of the 2020s, Illinois is slower than the Midwest, and the Midwest is slower than the US. So the Midwest has been a slow growth region for the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 4.5 decades at least. All right. And Illinois has been right there along with it. All right. So this is not a new thing. So the fact that I'm not at all surprised to see that the Midwest and Illinois numbers are below the US number here. This has been going on for 60 years, and it's really just a return to normal. Okay, we're going to get to why, but I want to point out one other thing, or a couple other things. One is that we're also seeing slower earnings growth. It's not the case in Illinois, but if we're talking about the Midwest as a whole, earnings growth, and this is real earnings, so this is adjusted for inflation, earnings per worker. So this is pretty close to a productivity measure. Real earnings per worker is pretty close. It's not hourly, but it's per worker. Growth in earnings per worker has also been slower in the Midwest than the US, and also for Illinois, but not as much. And finally, home price growth has been slower in the Midwest and in Illinois than the US. So this isn't a growth number. This is actually levels. This is from Zillow, and this is the average home price by region. And you can see that since 2000, the overall US average home price is up to about $350,000, whereas in Illinois and the Midwest, it's more like $250,000. And Illinois used to be quite close to the US because of Chicago, but now it's actually dropped to be much more kind of in line with the Midwest. So that actually gets me to Chicago. Chicago is about 2/3 of the Illinois economy. I think it's more than 2/3 of the Illinois economy. It's about 2/3 of Illinois' workers. But so Chicago really dominates Illinois. So Chicago's in red here. Illinois is in green, but you can see that their lines are very close. And so what's interesting here is that Chicago used to be kind of a median large city in terms of the cost of living here. Chicago is now really, and this is a development that's kind of happened in the last, 5 to 10 years. So pretty recently, Chicago has become one of the cheapest big cities in the country. So if you look at the 20 biggest cities in the country or metro areas, not this, I'm talking about the metro Chicago, not Chicago, the city of Chicago. But if you look at the 20 biggest metro areas, New York's the biggest, then LA, then Chicago. All right. Chicago is, even though it's the third biggest metro, and it's actually the ranked 19th in terms of cost of living, and at least if you measure cost of living by the average price of a average home price. And so what's happened here is other places have grown a lot faster and gotten more expensive, especially the South. So I've put up Houston and Dallas. Houston and Dallas, 15 years ago, were really considered cheap places to live. They were big places that were cheap. They're not cheap anymore, at least not compared to Chicago. So Houston and Chicago are about the same. Dallas is now more expensive than Chicago, and so it's really not the case anymore that it really is truly the case that the Midwest is the cheapest place to live in the country, and that goes along with slower employment growth and slower wage growth. You get slower wage growth, you get slower employment growth. Kind of the thing that you also get is a lower cost of living. And so these things all go together, especially if we're thinking about there's just slower labor demand growth here than there is in other parts of the country. And so we're seeing lower wage growth and lower jobs growth as a result. Okay, so now the question is why? What's going on here? And that's what I'm going to talk about now with the remaining time I've got. Okay, so the number one reason that I want to point to is that the Midwest is concentrated in a slow growth industry, and that's manufacturing. And to show you that this is a slow growth industry, I've put up here manufacturing share of GDP over the last, since 1950, so over the last 70 years, what's happened to manufacturing share of GDP? It's gone down a ton. So in 1950, it was about 27% of GDP of output came from manufacturing. Now it's about 11%. And this is the same for employment. So it was about, a third, 30 or so percent of workers were in manufacturing in 1950. We're down to about 13% today. So we've really seen manufacturing, the economy shift away from manufacturing, and it's shifting towards services, shifting towards education, towards healthcare is the big one that we've seen big growth in employment and output in from healthcare. But shifting also towards professional and business services like software, all the things, software development, business consulting, all of these types of business service type jobs have become more important as manufacturing has shrinked. So in the Midwest, we're the place that, all of our flagship industries are manufacturing. In Michigan and in Indiana, it's the auto industry. In Illinois and Iowa and Wisconsin, it's heavy machinery. So John Deere, Caterpillar, those are these huge important manufacturing industries around here. They're not growing as fast as the rest of the economy. There's still plenty of people employed in them, but they're just not needing as many workers as they used to. In Chicagoland, it's steel, right? So there's the steel factories are still there, and they're still making tons of stuff on the shores of Lake Michigan and in Northwest Indiana, but they need way fewer workers than they needed 50 years ago. Their output's higher, but because of automation, they just don't need as many workers. All right, and so that means that we're slower growth. I think that's the number one reason we're slower growth. People also like to highlight, and I think this is important, that the weather, with the advent of things like air conditioning, there's a big draw to the south and to the west because of sun and warmth. And I think that's true too, but I think this is the bigger story. Okay. All right, so now that my question is why this switch from people from manufacturing to a service sector economy? Go ahead.
I was gonna say, because a lot of the stuff can be done overseas anyway, and the service economy, you need, you can't really like automate stuff as much. And it's
Yes.
more of an educated population.
Yes, so that's that is so there's a recent paper that came out. So that's the supply side, right? So it's easier to automate manufacturing production than it is to automate, like you can't. Someday maybe we'll be able to automate massages or stuff like that, but you know, like there's just a whole lot of or doctor visits. There's just a whole lot of service sector jobs that are hard to automate. Not that the service industry isn't trying, but it's just harder. So that's the supply side story. I'm actually going to emphasize the demand side story, which according to this paper that I found recently, it's about 75% demand by their estimate and 25% supply. So the supply side too would be globalization. But the thing is that globalization really took off in earnest kind of in the 80s with Japan, and then in the 2000s with China. So you can see in the data, you can definitely see an effect of China, but this is a longer run trend than globalization. And that's, it's not like it's not there, but I think what I want to tell you is more of a demand side story, which is that as we've gotten richer, as we've automated and figured out how to do stuff better, we tend to spend more of our budget share on services. So the idea here is that, you know, the price of, say you have 2 TVs in your house, the price of TVs gets cut in half, which has happened. Do you go out and buy do you double the price of a TV goes in half? Do you end up buying 2 TVs or 1? In general, I think what we're seeing in the data is that people do go and buy another TV because the price has gone down, but they're not buying twice as many TVs if the price is in half. They're buying maybe 1 more TV. And so as a result, if this is happening overall for goods in general, as you get richer, you're spending a smaller and smaller share of your budget on goods and a bigger share on services. And this is what we're seeing. So what I put up here is the share of consumption spent on goods since 1950. All right. And so in 1950, according to the BEA, 60% of consumption was spent on stuff and not services. Now we're down to 30%. All right. And you can actually see that the pandemic had an effect on this number, right? So goods share of consumption spiked during the pandemic because it was hard to go out and buy services. But that's actually already come undone. And it wasn't actually that big of a spike compared to this overall trend, right? It mattered, but it wasn't like there's this bigger trend that's clearly matters more. And then even on the investment side, we're seeing less and less investment in physical things. So in 1950, 95% of investment purchases were of physical things, of equipment for factories, cars, structures. Now we're down to about 70%. And what's replaced it? It's intellectual property, which is basically software. So even on the investment side, more and more of what's the investments that are being made are in non-physical things. Okay, so you might say, well, yeah, what about globalization? Oh yeah, go ahead.
This is slightly in tangent to what we're talking about, but what are some of the projects that you're currently pursuing in regards to centrally backed digital currencies and stuff like that?
Okay, well, I will take that at the end. Let me finish up and we can talk about digital currencies for sure. Okay, yeah, so you might say, let's go to the China story for a second. So you might say, well, what about China? You know, China just took all the manufacturing from here. It took a lot of manufacturing. It was kind of the lower value added stuff. Like, for example, I have kids and I'm pretty sure that the price of stuffed animals has not changed since I was a kid. And so my kids probably do have twice as many stuffed animals as I did growing up. So that kind of manufacturing did leave the US and go to China. But even in China, there's some evidence, and this is in this data, that China is also leaving manufacturing behind and switching to a more service sector oriented economy. So the global economy also appears to be deindustrializing to some extent. And that's going to, of course, have a bigger effect on regions that are concentrated in manufacturing. Okay. And so then I think this is it. Yeah. So then the question is, okay, what's the forecast? I don't think this is a very sophisticated forecast for manufacturing relative to GDP, but at least S&P thinks that this trend is going to continue, that manufacturing is going to grow more slowly. Manufacturing production is going to grow more slowly than GDP, and that this trend is going to continue. Now, it can't go to zero. We're always going to need some people in factories producing, maintaining the machinery, but there's actually the possibility that it could keep going lower. And the precedent for this is agriculture. In the mid 1800s in the US, 50% of workers were in ag or were farmers. Now we're down to 2% in the US. So I'm not saying that manufacturing necessarily is going to go to 2%. I don't know, but there's still, I think, room for manufacturing to be a shrinking share of the economy. And that's at least for the Midwest, where I'm always thinking about what's going on in the Midwest relative to the US. That's a reason to think that growth is going to continue to be slower here than in other parts of the country. So with that, I'll skip the summary and then, yeah, let's go to Q&A. And I'll take your question right now, and then you all can ruminate about the other questions I have. So central bank digital currency. So this is a little bit out of my wheelhouse. And so let me just tell you that, it's an opinion. I'm not an expert on it, but let me give you kind of my take on my slightly informed take on digital currencies and as a result, central bank digital currencies. So there are kind of two main things we use money for. One is a store of value, like savings, and then the other is for transactions. And from what I can tell at the moment, it makes transacting easier. So instead of bartering, we're using money to exchange. There's a standardized value for it. So from what I can tell, the digital currency out there right now is being used primarily as a store of value and not as a means of transacting. So I've never, I guess I wish I'd bought Bitcoin back in the day. I didn't because it seemed like kind of silly. But I haven't really heard of many people actually using Bitcoin for everyday purchases. I think it happens, but it seems like it's mostly for, off the books kind of stuff. Although it's kind of not a really great currency for doing, I think cash is actually probably better if you're doing illegal stuff. It's harder to trace than Bitcoin, right? So the question is, what is Bitcoin useful for? What is its use case that it's replacing the US dollar for? And I think its main use case is as a speculative asset, similar to gold. So I think it's kind of like digital gold, where there is like some actual practical use for gold, I guess, and it's a good conductor. It looks pretty in jewelry. But there's a lot of people that just buy gold because it's like a hedge against inflation. And I think that's kind of what Bitcoin could become, but Bitcoin's also like its value is more volatile than gold and the US dollar. So it doesn't seem like a great place to put your money if you're trying to hedge against inflation. So at the moment, it's just not clear to me what the use case is for digital currency in general. However, I mean, if there really was, if the central banks did step in and like make a digital currency, maybe it would be easier to use than Venmo. But like, I think Venmo is already kind of the digital currency that is actually useful for doing transactions, and it's all in US dollars. Yeah, so that's the puzzle for the central banks. I think they might end up, there might be some movement toward that just because if the system ever, it seems like you can imagine a world where it actually is easier to exchange in digital currency than um, um, credit cards and physical currency, but it's not clear that the technology it's not clear to me that the central bank's necessarily going to come up with a better way to do it than Venmo.
Are they actively pursuing it, or is there any?
They put out a report, the Fed put out a report, I think it was about 6 months ago to a year ago, where they talked about, kind of, at least back then, what the thinking was. I looked at the report, but I can't really remember what was in it at this point. So it's definitely being discussed, but I don't think, from what I can tell, based on what's out there, that there's a ton of movement toward it. That there's certainly not any quick movement toward doing it. So. Any other questions?
I think I have one question also from class. So
Sure.
the class asked because they watch the because the news put us their learning material for our course regional economic development. I asked them to watch the video is what we do for Federal Reserve for Bank of Chicago.
Okay.
Then they're wondering. So I think for that video introduce the cities that has the Federal Reserve Bank.
Yeah.
Then they're wondering why are reserve banks located in these certain cities?
Yeah. Right. So the question is, why do we have a Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago and a
also,
Cleveland, but we
Yeah.
don't have like a Denver?
yeah.
So the answer is that they decided on these locations based on where population was in 1910.
Oh,
So it was, the banks are kind of evenly distributed across the country in terms of where population was in 1910. And so we have, all these banks in the Midwest. There's the San Francisco has the entire West Coast, and then I guess Kansas City is kind of the furthest west aside from San Francisco. So yeah, and then, since then there's just been ton of population growth in the South and certainly west of the Mississippi. But they didn't end up, I don't think anyone wants to get into revisiting trying to have the Federal Reserve Act in Congress, have Congress change the Federal Reserve Act such that they would relocate these banks to other parts of the country.
they see the population change.
Yeah.
Actually. Population changes
Yeah.
over.
But I think the other thing is that, like, with transportation costs have come down a ton, and so it's just the fact that the location of these where the reserve banks are is really not like it used to be, that you could actually have different interest rates depending on which your regional bank your bank was affiliated with. That ended a while ago. It's really now just a national organization with this kind of legacy footprint from 100 years ago. So I think you had one more question.
My question was about, I don't know if know a lot about like what's been happening in Argentina recently with the de-dollarization. I don't know if you could.
Or they want to dollarize, right?
Dollarizing. I don't know if you could like talk about that, if that's like a good idea that they're just getting rid of their currency and.
Yeah, so that's a little bit that's out of my wheelhouse too. But yeah. So I don't know, like it seems, I think my guess is that to do it, it would be really a big shock to the economy. That the question is, could you come up with a policy that could slow inflation that would be less painful? Probably, but that would be, but like I don't know enough about kind of the politics and Argentinian economy to know whether that really is the easiest way to stop inflation, or the least least painful way to slow inflation. But yeah, so it's definitely a good example of what happens if you don't keep inflation under control. So. sorry for a less, not great answer. Any other, yeah, we have another question.
Yeah, it's just, kinds of research. Is there, can we go to the Chicago, Federal Reserve Fairness Report?
This presentation,
Yeah, the report, actually,
which article?
for today's presentation.
Oh, no, yeah, so this, I'm not gonna post this on our website. But if you want, I can email it to you. You can give me your email address. I'll send it, I'll email it to you.
And, so you've been updated every year?
Yeah, I mean, what I do is I'll, you know, if these slides, I confess that I did not make all these slides just for this presentation. But yeah, no, I update them, you know, it's like this forecast gets updated once a month. So whenever I go out and give a presentation, I'll update the forecast, update the slides, and then, you know, depending on where my research and interests are at the moment, I do switch stuff around a little bit every time. Okay.
So I think the other question, I find it's very interesting. You're showing the Midwest actually is employment growth is below U.S. average. It means 1970s based on your
Yeah.
figure. I'm wondering this is if you trace back even further,
Yeah.
it's already long history, or is start from actually the 1970s. Below.
So the data gets a little bit murkier once you go. The easy to use data stop in kind of the 60s, start in the 70s, 60s and 70s. But really, what you can, I think what I can say is that, you know, you can kind of trace the rise and fall of the Midwest in terms of its growth by manufacturing. So there's this hump of manufacturing where, like, starting in the 1850s, manufacturing share of GDP of the economy really goes up, and it got up to 30%, and it peaked in 1960, and then it's been coming down. So, you know, the Midwest was definitely one of the was similar to other parts of the country when manufacturing was rising. And it's a little bit more complicated because before, kind of in the pre-war era, the South like exited the ag economy and got much more manufacturing. You know, it did its structural transformation from ag to industrializing much later than the North and the Northeast. And so there's this concept of convergence. So convergence was happening regionally within the US before the 1950s. And so there was actually some growth was actually quite fast in the South too, even as manufacturing was rising, and which was really pushing up growth in the Midwest. So the story gets a little more complicated before, you know, kind of in the first half of the 20th century. But the story's pretty much, yeah, once the kind of the South caught up with the rest of the country in terms of development, then that was right around the time manufacturing started kind of shrinking, and the Midwest started lagging.
I see. It's like the later half of 20th century actually is more consistent with the manufacturing share that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So yeah.
So then, what's the currently kind of like a Federal Reserve Bank have any like initiatives related to solve these issues, like or
So initiatives related to
like increase this employment growth for because of the manufacturing share decrease. Is any
is the Fed trying to do anything?
yeah.
So I mean, the Fed can't really do anything beyond change the interest rate. We're pretty limited in terms of that's our one policy interest. But on the fiscal side, on the congressional side, there are all kinds of programs to try to deal with to try to help places that are the towns in the Midwest that have deindustrialized. So, you can if you go, outside of Chicago, you can if you go downstate, for example, you can pretty easily, most of the downstate Illinois metros have actually, many of them have shrunk. And so there are definitely policies out there that are trying to help places like that grow on the fiscal side. But it's the problem is that you're fighting this kind of built-in, or this trend that's not in your favor. So you're pushing back against something that's out of your control in terms of in my opinion, this kind of evolution of the economy from manufacturing to service sector. So, and the policies would be things like, subsidies for, very recently, subsidy like the CHIPS Act, for example, like those are going to be subsidies for manufacturing plants that are going to primarily be in the middle of the country. And but the thing is that they're just not jobs growth engines. They're going to be huge capital investments, but they're actually not going to be hiring that many new workers, right? So it's not going to be enough to like repopulate these places, but more kind of stem the flow. So
Sometimes the capital and the employment different.
yeah. Thought I saw you had one more question. I guess we can be done, but
Yeah.
Let's talk after, I guess, so we can dismiss people.
You want to take one more, or do we?
I guess if you all want to hear this last question, go ahead.
I was just kind of wondering if somebody's like interested in maybe like doing stuff with the Fed, either like working at the Fed or something, like how would somebody go about doing that?
Right. So we have interns in the research department. We also have research assistants that we hire after you graduate from college. And so generally the way that the program's designed, you're not required to go get a PhD in economics, but it's like kind of a pre-doc program. But the way to get in is you want to have research experience doing data work. To be a good candidate for these kinds of internships or research assistants, the ideal candidate has been a research assistant for a professor as an undergrad and has experience working in like R or Python, and then also has, typically they're going to have a senior thesis that is on an economics topic, where you've done some econometrics and stuff. Now that's to go into the research department and help out as a research assistant in the research department. There are also other jobs, internships, and that are not in economics, that would, like where you would maybe be doing coding or helping out in like the supervision and regulation side. And I actually don't know as much about those types of jobs. But yeah.
Okay. Thank Dr. Tom Walstrum, who is an interesting stories using these indicators to show us that the U.S. and the Midwest economies.
Yeah, thanks for having me. A lot of great questions. Glad to be.
I really enjoyed it. I'm not an economist, so I hope you come back again.
Do you want to take a picture? 3 or 4?
Oh, sure.
Yeah.